All right, today we begin grade 8 or that level. And in this one, we are looking at the way of the word. What we're going to do is to try and understand the Bible, how it came about, its history, its journey, and things like that. The first thing for us to consider is that every religion has what they call scriptures, religious scriptures. And so when you look at Hinduism, there are the Vedas, Islam, there's Quran, Buddhism, there's Tripitaka, and of course, for Christians, we have the Holy Bible. Now, in all of these religions, these books known as scriptures are considered special. Yes, they may have been written by humans, but they're definitely special. And generally, there are three different views of scriptures. One is that scriptures are completely the words of God. Second is that they are completely the thoughts of the words of men, though maybe thoughts from God. Third is that they are a hybrid, a little bit of God speaking, a little bit of human writing the thoughts that they have down. But all religions consider their scriptures holy. By that we mean sacred, they're special, they must be treated specially, that they contain the truths and the words important to that religion, to that faith. And Christians believe that the Bible is scripture. And this means that the words of the Bible are not just simply words on a page, but rather the very thoughts of God, if not the direct words of God, but the very thoughts of God. And this is important as we begin the journey on the scriptures, this religious idea which is present everywhere, that there are holy materials, that there are holy books, and these form the basis of that religion or of that faith. And when we come to that understanding, then you can understand, even if you're not a Christian or you're just coming to terms with Christian, that this is scripture, this book is scripture for Christians. The question is why and how did that happen? And that's what we will learn during these next few lessons. But for now, we need to clear our heads. The Holy Bible is scripture. Holy, sacred, special, important, significant, all of those terms for people who call themselves Christians. When you say that the Bible is scripture, we need to consider the significance of that. What does that really mean? What do you mean when you say it is scripture? And I would like to suggest three things that go into that kind of statement. First of all, when we say it is scripture, we mean that it is the foundation. It is the bottom line. This is where everything you need to know, everything you need to learn about that religion, about that faith, this is where it's at. So it's scripture, it's foundation. Secondly is scripture is sacred. By that we mean that it is holy because of its special relationship with God, either because God is the source or because it is speaking about God. See, so it's not just another book that you add to your library shelf or that you put on a shelf and allow dust to cover it. No, it is a book for life. And that's what makes it sacred as well. By being sacred, we get the sense that God is speaking to us through this book. God who's way up there and we don't know how far away he is, yet he is way down here and he is talking to us. He is dealing with humans. He is answering our questions or giving us thoughts on how to answer questions. You know, sometimes we don't find every answer in the Bible, but we find clues, kind of like a discovery journey. And so it is sacred because of all of that, the impact that it has on those who believe in that text as well. A third component of scripture is this. To every religion, and especially to Christianity, the Bible is treasure. It's not just book. It's not just sacred. It is treasure. It is holy treasure. It is treasure to be maintained. It is treasure to be kept. It is treasure to be guarded. It is treasure to be learned and to be memorized and make a part of our hearts and soul. It's the most important thing. And for 2,000 years, Christians have given their lives for the simple pleasure of being able to have the Bible and read it. Even when the Bible was outlawed, when the Bible was removed from them, when they could not keep printed copies, they kept copies in their mind, in their brain. It's a treasure. Treasure is something that you guard, something that you consider important. And so this is the view of Scripture. This is what it means to have Scripture. It's the foundation of everything we believe. It is considered sacred because of special connection with God, and it is like treasure, maybe more valuable than gold or diamonds. Once Christians accepted the fact that the Bible is Scripture, then they accepted the fact that the Bible is the one that governs their lives. Now, this did not happen easily. It took time for people to accept all the different books of the Bible and treat all of them as Scripture, and then eventually accept the whole Bible and say that this is Scripture. But once that happened, then it became the driving force of the faith. In two ways. It was the driving force of Christian history, and we see how Christian history can be traced alongside what we might call the history of the Bible. Whether the church moved in this direction or that direction often came as a consequence of studying the Bible and finding light and so on in the Bible. But I think for most Christians, though, it is not so much about history that matters. It is about personal experience. Most people who encounter the Bible for the first time, it may seem like just another book. Okay, let me read it. And you discover lots of interesting stories. There are lots of beautiful songs and poetry. There are even some great prophecies about the end of the world, So it's interesting. It's definitely not a boring book. But the more the time that a person spends with the Bible, the more you realize, this book is trying to change my life. There have been some famous people in history whose lives were turned around completely by this book. There was a man in the 5th century called Augustine. He lived a wild life as a young man, grew up in a Christian church, but he was a wild young man. And then one day he encountered the Bible, we're not sure exactly how, on his own, and it turned his life around. He became one of the great church leaders of all time. In more modern times, not long after the Second World War, there was a philosopher, C.S. Lewis, in England, who really did not believe the Bible. And he was like, it's not so important. But then he also had an encounter. Again, we're not quite clear how that happened. And it turned his life around, and he became one of the great Christian thinkers and writers of the 20th century. In more recent years, there was another man, a journalist, who actually said that there's no such person as Jesus. All these stories in the Bible, they're not historically accurate. And he made a trip to Israel in an attempt to discover the truth of the Bible like a journalist would do. What he found was Jesus instead. What he found was a book that changed his life. And I think if you try it, not just head knowledge, but heart knowledge, then maybe you'll discover that the Bible is Scripture, the kind of Scripture that can change your life as well. The next thing for us to think about is, how did all this happen? How did these books, written over such a long period of time by so many different people, gathered over more than 1,500 years, eventually become Scripture and get treated in this special way? So how does a book become Scripture? Well, there are 3 stages to becoming Scripture. We know that every book of the Bible began with what we call an oral stage, not a written stage, but the stage where the message is being spoken. Jesus did not write anything down. He preached, he told stories. The prophets, before they wrote down their books, and there were prophets who did not even write down, they simply spoke. And it is possible, like fathers telling their children stories about the past, all those fathers in Israel, about the history of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And those were passed down before somebody sat down and said, okay, let's put them on paper. We know that ancient history in every civilization began in oral stage. In fact, anthropologists, sociologists will tell us that in the earliest years of human civilization, everything was transmitted orally. People spoke, people memorized and listened. Now, your generation is all about the machine. It's all about these gadgets. You have become a completely visual generation. But in the old days, when people had no gadgets, there were no computers, there were no tablets, there were no mobile phones, there were nothing to help them. They simply had to listen and listen. In fact, in my early years of school, that was the most important skill, listening, trying to memorize what the teacher has said. And that is how the Bible began. The next stage is what we call autograph. This is when somebody sat down and said, okay, let's write it all down. We know, for instance, that Moses is the one who sat down and wrote all the stories we have in Genesis. That John is the one who sat down and wrote all the stories of Jesus in the Gospel of John. Unfortunately for us, those original writings, what we would say the original or the first copy, known as autographs, none of them exist. Eventually, they got lost in time or they were destroyed by overuse. Because after all, they had very fragile materials, the kind of paper made from grass called papyrus, and animal skin, which could last a little bit longer but didn't last forever either. So the third stage came, and that's the one that is most important to us. People realize to keep this knowledge going, we must make copies. These are known as manuscripts. And so copies of copies of copies of copies. And today when we talk about the Bible, that's the journey. The original listeners heard it spoken, and then somebody wrote it down, and you and I are reading the copies that were left behind. You could be a copyist. Today that's what we would call. They were called scribes in Bible time. You can make manuscripts of the Bible, and then you will understand the journey. Once we have written copies of all the different books that would make the Bible, then there were 3 stages through which these books would have to go through. The first stage is what we would call the writing stage. Okay. Now, we kind of spoke about that already, but writing here is more than just the author writing, but all those copying that happened. So in Babylon, the exiles began to make copies. In Egypt, they made copies. Later on, they would make copies everywhere in the world. In Rome, in Alexandria, in Antioch. And so we have copies of the Bible right across the Mediterranean world. Once those copies began to appear, then the next step in the process had to take place. And that is, let's collect them. It's kind of like what an editor would do. The writer would send one chapter and then the next chapter and the next chapter, and then the editor would arrange them, and eventually it becomes a book. Someday when you publish a book, you will understand how this process works. Nothing has changed. It's exactly the same process we do today. The collection stage is kind of both an editing process as well as a process of organizing the books. Why do we have Genesis first? Why do we have Matthew first? Why is Revelation the last book? Why is Malachi the last book in the Old Testament? That went through this process of collection. The first person we know who began this process was a man known as Ezra. Now, the process was not completed for the Old Testament until about 100 AD, and for the New Testament until around 397 AD. So long periods of time, lots of people, lots of scribes, lots of copyists, lots of collections. And we find different people attempt different kinds of collections. You will read their names in the book, in the material. Once that process is more or less complete, then the Jewish people for the Hebrew Bible and later the Christians for the New Testament had to sit down and say, okay, we need to standardize this text. The process eventually became known as canonizing the text. What that means is to recognize what is the exact reading. You see, when you have, let's say, 10 different copyists, 10 different scribes, you could have differences in spelling, in word choices, depending on the copies that they had in their hands. If you've ever done editor's work, you will understand how this can happen. So they had to standardize the text and recognize it. That process we call canonization. Around 100 AD, the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, was canonized. Around 397 AD, the New Testament was canonized, and then the whole scripture became complete. That is the journey. Quite long, quite exciting, and really a wonderful journey. We have spoken about the journey of the Bible, from oral stage to becoming a standard text. Now let's focus a little bit more in depth at each part of the Bible. Let's look at the Hebrew Bible first. That's what Christians call the Old Testament. That's that first part of the Bible. And the reason to refer to it as the Hebrew Bible is because it came separately and it's all written in Hebrew, and so it probably makes sense to do that. Now, the earliest book written would have been Genesis. That would be around 1500 BC. The last book written was around 420 by a prophet called Malachi. In between, they started making copies during the exile in Babylon and also in Egypt. And so we began to see manuscripts. And then eventually the Jewish leaders, after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, got together for a kind of a meeting, a sort of an exchange of ideas at a place called Jamnia. This is sometimes referred to as the Council of Jamnia, approximately 100 AD. And at that council, they decided, okay, these books, and also separated them into 3 sections: the Torah, the prophets, and the others. So Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The others means the other writings. So they arranged the books, they collected them, they agreed the process. This will be the standard text. But there was still a lot of flux with the language because it came from different sources, from Egypt, from Babylon, from Jerusalem, from other places. And so after the Council of Jamnia, a group of scribes known as the Masoretes sat down and began to work. It took them a long time to standardize a process. One of the problems was that Hebrew has no vowels. So how do you know if a word means A or O? And so they had to invent a system called a pointing system, so we will know whether to read a word with an A sound or an O sound or an U sound. That process took a long time. They also found a process whereby, okay, this is where the cutoff will be, this is where the beginning was. And they fix everything into columns so that you can actually count how many letters this way, how many letters this way. So hopefully there will be no more mistakes. The text that they produce, which was completed around 970 AD, is known as the Masoretic text. And that became the standard text for the Old Testament, for the Hebrew Bible until today. Both Jews and Christians accept the Masoretic text as the formal Hebrew text for the Old Testament, all because of this fantastic work that the Masoretes did. You never know what shape your service to God can be, and this is one very important aspect of that work. The journey of the New Testament followed similar process as the Hebrew Bible. The Christian scriptures began with an assortment of books and people. In fact, the early Christians were great writers. There were lots and lots and lots of books. But eventually they had to decide how many of these books do we want. Let me give you an example. By the end of the first century, there were at least 30 different Gospels. And the Christians realized we cannot read all 30 Gospels. This is too much. Somebody came up with a suggestion, okay, let's have only 4. And then the debate was, which four? Eventually they settled on the four we have: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But that was a long process. It took nearly 400 years for that process to be completed. Okay, so there was that journey. The process went through what we call church councils. Council after council after council sat down and looked at the list of books as books began to appear. They did the same things with the writings of Paul. For instance, Paul wrote 4 letters to the church in Corinth, but only 2 of them were included into the New Testament. So they went through that decipher, weeding, filtering process. They were pretty good at it. And by 397 AD, they had fixed the names and the listing of the New Testament. 4 Gospels, 1 Acts, 13 letters from Paul, and then a few other assorted letters and Revelation. And that list, never really changed in history after that. It became standard, it became canonized form. And so by around 397, you can say that Christians had a canonized scripture. All the books of the Bible at this great council held that year in Carthage finally said, these are the books that would make the Bible. This is Christian scripture. All the books of the Hebrew Bible and all these new books listed by the council. And so the canon of the Bible was finally completed. It was now a complete structure. And the understanding of the church was that from this point onwards, nothing can be added, nothing can be subtracted from these texts anymore. This is what scripture actually means. No more addition, no more subtraction, only study after that. And so we have the Holy Bible. The journey of the Bible did not stop in 397 AD. Once the church began to grow and spread and spread and spread around the world, they began to realize, hey, these people cannot read Greek, they cannot read Hebrew, they need to read the Bible in their own languages. And so one of the greatest efforts ever made about a book in human history, and that was to translate the Bible. Today, the Bible has been translated into just about every living language that is listed with the United Nations or that actually exists. The work of missionaries through 2,000 years of history has been to translate the Bible. And sometimes they went into a place where people did not have a written language. They had to create a written language form so that they can translate the Bible and these people could read. This is why most of the languages in the world follow the Roman script rather than their own, except for most of Asia. So most of Africa, most of South America, most of the rest of the world followed those scripts of the Bible because the missionaries knew we had to translate, but they used what they had in their hands, what was available. However, when you read the translations, particularly English, which has the most number of translations, you will notice obvious differences. And you'll say to yourself, wait a minute, this translation, we call them version, has a certain kind of reading. This version has another kind of reading. Which one is the best? Well, the truth is you need to read as many versions as possible to get the best reading. But why do we have the different versions, the different translations? Well, there are 3 ways of translating. One way says we must stick closely to the words. It's called a literal translation. Another version says we must stick closely to the meaning of the text, never mind the words so much. It's called dynamic translation. And then there's a third option somewhere in between called the optimal translation. We must pay attention to the words. We must also care about the actual meaning. And by meaning, we mean what do these words mean and how are they understood in this new language. So if you translate from English into Thai, from Hebrew into Thai, first you must understand what is Hebrew saying, and then you must understand, can the same thing be said in a way that Thai people can understand? And those of you who have learned a second language, a third language, bilingual, trilingual, or multilingual, You know the difficulties of moving from one language to the other, how meanings and thoughts can easily be lost in between. And so you have to read the preface of every Bible you buy to know the translation. Are they following literal translation, dynamic translation, or optimal translation? The Bible today is still the number one selling book in the world. You might think at a time when people are less interested in the Bible that would have changed. No, it hasn't changed. And today people are not just buying printed copies of the Bible, they're also buying Bible softwares and accessing the Bible online, like Bible Gateway and so on and so forth. So the Bible is playing an even bigger role in today's history, but we'll learn more about that in later grades.